blending is hard. Blending's really hard. So I say that so that we can have a little grace for people. But also I'm going to talk about my approach to blending. And hopefully it will be helpful because I think all whiskey drinkers should be blending. It's a magical experience, and you don't need to work for a distillery to have the magical experience. You really don't. I think it should become a normal part of being a whiskey drinker. If you have more than 2 bottles at home of whiskey, you should be blending. It helps us learn more about the whiskeys we have. I'll get into it. Anyway, so let's talk about blending, because blending, when done well, cool bottle. Blending, when done well, is way more than the sum of its parts. 1 + 1 does not equal 2, it equals 14 or -3. And I approach it a very specific way. It's a blend of everyone I've learned from, but I also have my own little thing that I'm bringing to it as a musician and with how my brain works. So, who have I learned from? I've learned from Edinburgh Whiskey Academy. I've learned from Nancy Fraley. I've learned from my friends the Licorishes. I've learned from Jared Hempstead and Gabe Ricard. And I've learned from Emma Crandall. I've learned from everyone I've ever blended with. Jake Clements, the distillers I've had the honor of blending the Texas Whiskey Festival blends with. Every time I work on blending with people, I learn. I've learned from Kyle Wells and Andrew Pena, who are at Crowded Barrel. Anytime you're around people, you have the opportunity to explore and engage and get a little bit better and go, oh, I never thought about that. Yes, I see that now. But I still have a fundamental approach. And it's funny, I used to think of it when I first started blending as bass, mid, highs, because I'm a musician and I think in EQs. And then in 2000, I think it was like 16, 17, anyway, I don't remember. I went to Iron Root Republic in North Texas and attended the ADI blending and maturation class with Nancy Fraley. And she used the exact same terminology, but her words were a pyramid, a base, middle, and a topper. And she builds in a pyramid style. And I was like, oh, that sounds familiar. I do exactly the same thing. I just use music words. And then she gave me a lot of context and knowledge around how she does it and where she learned it from. And I learned so much in that class. And when I blend, what I typically do is say I start with, I don't think in terms of threes like you always have to have 3 whiskeys. I think in terms of directionality of flavors. So I'm going to want one directionality of flavor to be the base that holds everything. I'm going to want something else to be what fills out all the mids and depths and gives it body and weight. And I'm going to want a third thing that adds this sort of unexpected sparkle and life to things. When I was blending the Jackalope, for example, I knew that I wanted to have a certain kind of weight to it. And so even though I thought I was going to use a lot of the MGP single grain or the MGP light whiskey, it turns out I used a lot less of it because it was so thin that anytime I put it in a higher proportion, it just turned the whole base thin. There was no base. And so I went with a lot of Balcones in that blend because I wanted the Balcones to sort of hold the body and the weight. And then I ended up using the MGP as the mid palate rounder. And then I used the Real Spirits as this sort of like boom sparkle that brought some things to life. So when I'm doing that from scratch, what I'll do is I'll create 20 or 30 samples where I literally just have a spreadsheet and I'm just running math. Like this one's 30, 20, 10. This one's 50, 40, 10. This one's, you see what I mean? And I'm just, oh, bam, 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 until they equal 100. That first one didn't equal 100, but I'm just, all these variations, and then I let them sit. And then I come back and I grade the 20 or 30 samples, or 10 or 12, and go, ooh, this one's headed a direction I like. And then I ditch all the others, and I narrow my focus, and I create micro variations of this direction. And I sort of expand it at a bigger scale, and that's fine. When you're working with smaller barrel counts, like 5 or 6 barrels at a time, that's pretty easy. When you're working with 600 barrels at a time, it's a whole other ball game. Now, on the upside, you tend to be working with batches at that point, and so you're not actually doing sampling 600 barrels. You're saying these 600 or these 100 barrels, all the same profile, all the same age statement, all generally the same direction. We're going to dump those together. That's going to be a batch. We're going to work off of that batch as one of our variations. And then you do the same rules apply. You work with, a dozen batches. And that can simplify things. For me, actually, the MGP, even though it was listed as a 1 in my brain, where it was Balcones Real and MGP, I had 3 things I was playing with. In reality, the MGP I was playing with was a batch of 8 barrels or 12 barrels that we had dumped together. And so I already knew that those had a consistent enough that they created one thing, so we dumped it together, and that was my one mix. But the most important thing is write it all down, and then when you're grading it, write all your notes down aggressively. And if you hit a point where you feel like I've lost perspective, take a break, come back tomorrow, look at all your notes again, do it again. So on that, let's take a break, talk about Lost Irish whiskey. I was attracted to this one in the store because of the bottle, and I'd never heard of it. And then it said this thing, 6 worlds, 3 styles. And I was like, okay, either this is bullshit, or it could be really fun and interesting. Or it could be bullshit and really fun and interesting. So I got it because I wanted to know what was going on. And so the idea, there's a Mexican-based company called Casa Lumbre, and they have partnered with a couple of Irish humans named Neil Sands and Tim Hurley, and to produce this brand. And all we know is this is the Mexican company's expansion into other spirits and backing of these guys. The barrels that are in here, the 6 barrels, are South African brandy casks, Japanese Mizunara, sherry casks, of course, in Europe, bourbon and Caribbean rum casks, and Colombian rum casks. Now, they're not all aged in those their whole life. They are buying whiskey, I do not know where from, and they are finishing it in all of those barrels, right? So that's 6 different styles of finished whiskeys, Irish whiskey. But it starts with Irish whiskey, and how do we know what styles of Irish whiskey? Well, they tell us. It's all 3. So grain whiskey, malt whiskey, and pot still Irish whiskey, which are the 3 styles of Irish whiskey. So that's why they say 3 styles. They're using every variation of Irish whiskey that is made, and they're spreading it into 3 casks. I do not know whether they're blending and then filling finishing casks, or whether they're taking the original 3 and putting them in finishing casks based on what would elaborate, and then blending everything after. Have no idea. If they were going for efficiency, they would blend all 3 of those styles together first and then fill those and try to get a one-to-one mirror of how things are impacting. If they really wanted to just own an astronomical amount of complexity, then they would have to make a decision beforehand. Do we think the Caribbean rum should be filled with the pot still? Do we think that the South African brandy should be filled with the column still grain whiskey? And that would take a lot of thought. And that could be really cool. I don't know if they're doing that. We have no idea. On the nose, it smells more grain whiskey than anything else. And by that, I just mean it smells really thin, really shiny, and I'm having a hard time getting anything but a thin, shiny sweetness. Let's see if we can... There we go. If we push it a little bit and get a little aggressive with it, I start to get a little bit more of the depth of the sweetness. I feel like the shininess of rum and grain whiskey is really dominating certain things, and I'm really looking for the brandy or the spiciness of Mizunara oak, and I'm not finding either of those things. The Australian tawny cask is kind of cool, but I'm not finding any of that tawny, maybe a hint of almond. But right now, honestly, I'm just getting a super densely sweet but shiny Irish whiskey. Definitely Irish in the nose. All right, let's try it. Man. Okay. Very simple. Just pure hard candy, slight biscuity pastry, really shiny vanilla. I would put this in the category of a almost budget dessert Irish direction. Not quite as thin and brittle as like a budget Jameson. A little more depth, a little more richness, a little more softness, but like not as much muskiness and complexity as like a pure pot still, which has some weight and heft to it. I really want this to be super nuanced and complex, and it's just not. And I struggled to think that maybe it's because there's so many things fighting for supremacy in this. It's good. Decent, enjoyable, not remarkable, not nuanced, not that complex. But I like it. I actually enjoy it, which, I mean, it didn't sound like I do, but I do. I do actually enjoy it. So there's a problem in a blend, and I was hoping that this wouldn't be an example of it, but I feel like it is. Not quite. It's almost an example of it. There's a point when you're working on a blend and you add one thing too many. And this has happened to me over and over and over. When I was working on Jackalope, I had to start over like 6 times. There's a point when you add one thing too many and the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. And there's no better way to describe it, but you're building and the palate is building and the palate's building and the nose is building, and then you add a little drop of this thing and the whole thing just goes whack and it goes flat, and it almost tastes like a flat soda. It's just soft and bland and simple and bleh, meh. Like listening to people talk with your hands over your ears. And the nose goes away and it's boring. And I've never ever been able to recover a blend by adding more and fixing it. Maybe it's possible. I don't know. But I've never been able to accomplish it. And what I do is I dump it and I go back to the last place where it was working. And I take a couple of steps back and I start over. And if you can get that complexity and richness, but maximum volume of what you're trying to create, you get this really brilliant dancing act. This is not flat. It didn't collapse and get boring and bland, but it is simple. And all of those things fighting with each other has kind of removed the complexity or the character or nuance of any one of those things. So when you're blending at home, remember, there's a point when you add too much and your whiskey just goes and falls apart. And then there's points when you are blending and you add something and it has a very unexpected result. One time I had a whiskey that was really smoky and then a lot of sherry cask. And then I added too much smoke and I added more sherry cask to bring the smoke down. And my next sip, the smoke had doubled, easily doubled. And with like 1 milliliter of more sherry cask, smoke blew off the roof. And I still don't know why that happened. There's probably some chemical reaction there that would make sense. And maybe it was that sort of faintiness of sherry that sort of doubled down on the smoke components and just made the smoke feel more. Like, you know how you can add salt to baked goods to make the sugar pop? I feel like that might have happened. I had a little bit of sherry and it made the smoke pop. But I had to start over on that thing because that was not the direction I wanted to go. You should be doing this at home. All you need is paper and a pen. Take notes, write things down, keep track of the math, try things, keep adding. If it falls apart, have enough notes that you can back up on the process to before it fell apart and try it again. And all you need is at least 3 bottles of whiskey. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here.